22nd of June 1941, Russia was invaded by 3 million German troops, split into 3 army groups. If Hitler defeated Russia, and most people thought he would, that would almost certainly result in Germany winning the war. Not only would the Germans control most of Europe, they would also have access to Russia's vast natural resources. In attacking Russia, the Germans repeated the tactics they had employed so successfully against France: blitzkrieg or lightning war. Fast armoured units punched through the enemy front lines in the expectation that the infantry would then encircle the confused Russian flanks. Albrecht Metzger was in Army Group South, advancing into the Ukraine.
We were astonished that the Russians had learned so much from our campaign in France that they we couldn't protect our flanks properly, and the Russians used that. They hid in the cornfields and in the woods and so on, and the moment the mass of the crowd of the armored cars had passed through, then they attacked again, and it was much more difficult than in France.
We knew that we had an enemy who was very tough and skilled in fighting, who was attacking mostly from behind our flanks. As a motorized division, we were generally far ahead and had unprotected flanks against which the Russians could operate.
Ungeschützte Flanken, in denen der Russe operierte.
After only 12 days, all 3 German army groups had penetrated deep into Russia. The Kremlin was peculiarly silent. At first, Stalin simply couldn't believe that Germany was invading his country and ordered Russian forces not to respond to what he called provocations. The Allies were worried that Russian silence meant the Soviet Union might capitulate and submit to occupation, as France had. Vladimir Rubinstein, a Russian translator, was working at the BBC radio monitoring station in the early hours of July the 3rd, 1941.
Well, at 3 o'clock, the Russians announced that there was going to be a special broadcast and that listeners should stand by. And we, of course, knew that this meant that something important was going to happen. And our customers in London at the various ministries, they were all warned that something was afoot. And at about 5:30 or so in the morning, finally, it came. And they announced, and they said, the chairman of the State Defense Committee is now going to make a statement. And for a second, I didn't really realize who it was, because that was a new title which Stalin had acquired not too long ago. And so it didn't quite click, and I said, oh my God, that's Stalin. So at last, now we shall know. And there it was. And it was pretty horrific, because he was evidently sitting somewhere in some sort of shelter, presumably underground, and the acoustics were ghastly. You could hardly hear what he was saying. The microphone was in the wrong place. The only thing that was clear and nice was the sound of the gurgling water which he poured into his glass from time to time. Now that was nice and clear. But anyhow, after a little while it became quite clear. And he announced that the Russians were going to stand firm, that they were going to oppose the Germans, that they were not going to give in, and therefore a certain amount of fear really abated.
Stalin's speech was broadcast throughout the Soviet Union. Calling his people brothers and sisters, he told them to imitate their ancestors' tactics against Napoleon and deny shelter and supplies to the invaders, to destroy their own dams, livestock and crops, even to burn their homes. This scorched earth policy showed the Germans that they now faced a far more determined enemy than they had in France. However, not everyone obeyed Stalin's orders. Many Ukrainians, recent victims of Stalin's man-made famine, greeted the German vehicles marked with black crosses as symbolic of a new crusade against Stalin, the Antichrist.
And in the south of the Ukraine, we found that people there would welcome us. They appeared in Sunday dress and offered bread and salt, which was a sign of peace that they expected. And there were these big posters, Hitler Osvoboditel, Hitler the man who will free us. But what Hitler did, and what particularly these crazy SS forces behind the front did, that was unpardonable, and that was what made it so difficult to have any hope that this might come to a good end.
Hitler's SS death squads were ostensibly in Russia to eliminate communist leaders, which they did, often hanging them for all to see. But most victims of the SS were Jews, who were rounded up, theoretically for resettlement. In fact, they were forced to dig their own graves before being executed en masse. Because the Soviet Union hadn't signed the Geneva Convention, Hitler announced that the usual rules of war were suspended, and the Red Army responded in kind, ignoring the normal conventions. The ambulance in Hans-Jörg Kimmich's division was clearly marked with a red cross to protect it from attack.
And the Russians were shooting precisely at this red cross, so that we then had to cover it with dirt, so that they would no longer see it, right from the start.
Not only were the Germans facing a far more ruthless enemy than they'd previously encountered, they were doing so in terrain much less hospitable than that of Western Europe. To make matters worse, many German divisions were still equipped with horses and outdated equipment from the First World War.
The
Russian roads were so muddy, or at first in White Russia so sandy, and then muddy afterwards, that the normal team would not be enough, because it was meant for war in Central Europe, for movements in Germany and France. When we got stuck in the mud in Russia, we would get additional horses, so as to draw a 2-horse vehicle with 4 horses. Then it would be a little better.